a vibrant democracy. The Declaration of Independence from 1948 is the establishment for this democracy, promising equality for all its citizens. When I'm saying citizens, 20% of the citizens of Israel are Palestinians, Arab Israelis, that are people that were in Israel in 1948. I'll speak about the occupied territories. It's a different story. This is from 1967, but I'm speaking now in 1948 borders. So the main thing that we're doing within ACRI, we're dealing with constitutional law. Now, I'm speaking about the democracy of Israel, but to be honest, we don't have a constitution. So how does it go together? We do have basic laws that one day where there will be a constitution, these basic laws will form the constitution. So our toolkit as lawyers is the basic laws that we consider as higher laws. There is an independent Supreme Court in Israel, I think very credible. So as I will tell later about my organization, we argue in the Supreme Court and we lose many cases as well. You don't always win. But it's credible and it's independence. And I think we protect, and the state as well, a wide spectrum of rights and freedoms. The main thing that is different than here, and I'm sure Mira will say more about it later, is that we don't have any separation between state and religion. Now, this is something very important to understand. The only way to get married, for example, is in the Orthodox rabbinical system for Jews or other religious systems for non-Jews. So I, for example, although my husband is a Jew and we could marry in Israel, we chose not to get married in Israel. We got married in the US because we decided that we do not practice the Orthodox way, and the rabbinical system was not for us. Now, it's not only the problem of the State of Israel. We inherit this system from the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was ruling before the British Mandate from 1517 to 1917, and the whole region is suffering, I would say, from my perspective, from this same symptom. So it's very popular. There's a huge tourism now from Israel to Cyprus to have civil marriage. And my friends who got married in Cyprus says that while queuing in a city hall in Larnaca, they meet people from all the regions. So you can find Jordanians and Lebanese and all the other people that inherit the same system. So it might be funny, but it has lots of implications, the fact that we don't separate. Marriage is one example, burial is another example. Status on divorce and it has lots of implications on women's rights. So I think these are the main issues as a framework. Also, in 1967, we occupied areas known today as occupied territories, Judea and Samaria, Palestine. You can name it. There are about 2 million people there, Palestinians. When I speak about democracy, it doesn't apply to the occupied territories. It's different because these people do not have a status of citizens. They're refugees. And the law on that part is not the Israeli regular law, but it's the law that was in Jordan in 1967, implemented by military law, Israeli courts, military courts. So it's a different story. So I'll stop here and.
Okay, but we can see that there's going to be a lot in more detail to get into, and so we'll follow up with some of that. But Mira, I want to give you a chance to talk a bit about the work that you do and the way in which that invokes some of the broader concerns about civil liberties as they play out in Canada.
Okay. Try again.
I'll get going while you.
So yeah, why don't you go ahead?
Okay.
And I pulled Mira into the conversation.
We'll replace your batteries.
You can borrow mine.
New batteries.
First of all, I want to just acknowledge and thank Coast Salish peoples in whose territory we're gathered tonight. I think it's a relevant acknowledgement to the conversation around civil liberties and civil rights and human rights. I also want to thank all of you for coming out on a daylight savings transition. You may be suffering like some of us. I'm quite honored to be on a panel with both of you and to speak about civil liberties and civil rights in Canada. I'll speak up. I want to start by saying that I think the whole notion of civil liberties is a political one. These are political decisions that are made from country to country. And in Canada, we often, I think of civil liberties in a fairly narrow sense about sort of what are the personal guarantees and freedoms that government cannot infringe on by law. And so that, we think of things like freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, freedom of press, the right to security and liberty. And we don't necessarily think about things like poverty and housing and other rights that we may think of more generally as human rights that don't necessarily fall into our more narrow definition of civil liberties. I raise that because I think it's an important point that these are decisions that have been made politically. And many of the civil liberties that people are fighting for today, whether it's on C-51 or the right to die, of course, are choices that we're making, are political choices. I think Canada has a very different view of liberty and of civil liberties than many other countries. We're definitely, as many will agree, we have more of a social contract and than individual determination. We certainly are more comfortable with social programs and collective programs than elsewhere, for example, in comparison to the States. And from the perspective of my work, which currently is with the Broadbent Institute, I would say that we look less at, from a libertarian point of view, we think about civil liberties under the purview of social democracy. And what does that mean and what does that look like? So for us, that means looking at social and economic rights in addition to personal liberties. So I can speak to specific examples as we go on this evening and how that plays out in our work. But
that sounds great, and really what you've done, Mira, so well for us is identify, I think, two different streams that we do want to talk about. The first is the area of very traditionally understood liberties, and so maybe what we'll talk about next is the conflict between security and liberty, but then I do want to come back to the notion of how socioeconomic rights configure modern understandings of liberty so that we can talk about poverty and educational rights and those sorts of things as well under this broad umbrella. But if I were to move now to ask about questions around security and the issues those pose for civil liberties, maybe Sharon, I'll go to you next to talk about how that plays out specifically in Israel.
Thank you. So I want to relate first to give a context what my organization is doing. So the Association for Civil Rights, האגודה לזכויות האזרח in Hebrew, was established in 1972 by North American Jews importing to Israel the model of the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, very similar to, I think, CCLA here.
Which is the Canadian Civil Liberties Association,
Civil Liberties Association. And the idea is to bring the whole idea of liberal values to Israel. Now, Israel at the time, we're speaking 5 years after the occupation, and also internal tensions between Mizrahi Jews, Sephardi Jews, and Ashkenazi at the time of the Black Panthers, the Panterim HaShorim, at the beginning of the 70s. Our claim to fame is our legal work. We do also education work, so we are defending human rights, but we are also bringing discourse of human rights, and we do also public outreach. So within, we have two main legal departments. One is dealing within Israel, as I discussed before. I said constitutional law. This is within Israel, and one is dealing with the occupied territories because it's a different kind of law. It's international law and humanitarian law. We're not speaking about equality as it's perceived here. Now, within Israel, in this department, we have a couple of small units. One is doing with the traditional, the civil and political rights, but we have another one that is doing socioeconomic rights. When I was an attorney with ACRI, when I started as an intern in 2000, I was dealing with socioeconomic rights like housing and poverty and other things. The third unit is dealing with the Arab minority, which is, as I said, 20% of our population. And you would ask, this should be the equality for the Arab Israeli, Palestinian Israel should be within the civil political rights. Why is it a different unit? Because we think the Arab minority is different. It's an indigenous group that it's suffering from discrimination. I would like to say there is a full equality, but it's not. Some of our biggest cases deal with the Arab minority, and we have challenges in this field. The last unit is dealing with immigration and asylum seekers, which is a whole story. Although we do have a border with Syria, Syrians are not applying to, they're not asylum seekers in Israel. We do have asylum seekers from Africa, mainly from South Sudan and Eritrea, and we deal with it. Now, as for security, human rights is a wonderful theory. Especially I think us as a group of people that were a minority not recent ago and were suffering as a minority, the notion of defending minorities is beautiful. It's a hard job on a daily basis because you're not popular in the majority, the idea of defending minorities. But it does have a contradiction with security, and security reasons in our neighborhood is something very serious, to be honest. It's easier to sit here in lovely Vancouver and to discuss it in a lovely place, but on the ground, just a week ago, somebody was stabbed not far away from my house in Tel Aviv. So how do you balance those things? And I think, especially as minorities, that it's important to be consistent about it and to put question marks on some things that can be taken for granted. And can security reasons be justified by everything we're doing? The answer, from my perspective, is no. Not at all. It has to be balanced. Can we dismiss completely the idea of security reasons? The answer is no. So I want to give a couple of examples that cases that we made. Profiling in airport screening. It's a case we took to court in 2007. Okay, so the world post 9/11 looked different than the world before. We're all used to go to airport, takes off our shoes, and if somebody would tell you in 1999 that you would do it one day, you would say, really? I mean, it's completely different. If some people here do remember, right? But for Arab Israelis to go to the airport, the Ben Gurion airport, was a different story until recently. So the whole screening was ethnic profiling. So everybody was a suspect. And it's hard. From one hand, we don't want to have any terror attacks. On the other hand, 20% of our population belongs to the Arab minority. Can we generalize and collectively say that they are all suspects? We thought that the answer is no, and the balance was not good. Now, I'll jump to the end. This case ended up in 2015. Okay, 7 years later, we lost the case. The petition to Supreme Court, we can go directly to Supreme Court. I didn't say it in the beginning. We can challenge collective cases to Supreme Court. And it was dismissed, but we got compensation. So that's a bit strange. You lost and you got money from the state. So we got money from the state because the reason it was dismissed was that they thought the petition was important, and the reason it was dismissed was because the remedy was given. The whole system of screening was changed. Now, this is an example of the ethnic profiling. Before I got this job 2 years ago, I used to be for 5 years the Equal Employment Opportunity Commissioner for the Ministry of Economy for the Central Region in Israel. So I was working for the government. My colleague, the commissioner for the North, is a Palestinian Israeli. And we would used to fly together sometimes, okay? Official, we would come, she would go to a different line. Okay, it's a completely, and I used to say, I'll wait for you, and she said, forget it, I'm used to it. Now, this is 20% of the population, and I think it's a good example of the balance. I mean, how do you bring your citizens to be part of the society when you always blame them? How do you bring your citizens to be part of the society when their schools per capita is less than the schools I'm going in West Jerusalem or in other places? Now, this is something that should be addressed, and surprisingly, I think the big jump in inequality was out of economic incentives. So in 2010, the government of Israel joined the OECD, the Organization for Economic Development. Thank you. And the OECD set criteria, and they said, okay, if you want to be a member of the developed countries, you have to show us numbers. Better participation of Arabs in the job market and better participation of ultra-Orthodox in the job market. So in this incentive, we show better number now, and the government is really investing. And this was balancing, in a way, the security reason. So what I want to say that sometimes security reason is a default, and we have to ask questions and to make sure we have answers. It cannot justify everything.
Well, that's a great moment to turn to Canada, because we've had some recent conversations about security and the impact of security measures on civil liberties and the need to question the necessity given the costs. And so, Mira, I'm going to ask you to maybe talk a bit about, in particular, perhaps Bill C-51 or about some other measures that we've recently been considering and criticizing in Canada for striking the wrong balance.
Yeah. So you make a really interesting point that, of course, it was the economic argument that eventually, led. It wasn't actually the human rights that daylighted the issue, and that it was forced upon through an economic argument, which you often see. It's and we saw through C-51. So of course, everyone here was probably part of the conversation around Bill C-51, which was sort of Canada's version of anti-terrorism bill, which we should note is still unresolved, has been was fought for months and months in the public here throughout the election, and remains unresolved with our current government, and I think is an important point to not forget about. I don't remember a time in my life when there was such an outpouring of support around civil liberties and around sort of what was the balance, what are we trading away? Of course, these aren't black and white questions, and I think to some degree we can learn from Israel in this respect. You might be surprised to hear that, but I think it's true, where you have very real security threats on a day-to-day basis, and are very much grappling with these questions in ways that to some degree I don't think we are in Canada. I think it's interesting to note that when that libertarians, who were a part of the conversation around Bill C-51, people are very interested in protecting their own civil liberties up until the point where we're talking about security or, military or defense spending. And interestingly, only the Social Democratic Party in Canada was the one to vote against Bill C-51. So there's real conversations around how we address very real security threats and what the tension is, but also what we're willing to trade away. And I think there was a sentiment that Canadians, in my view, that the government of the time underestimated in terms of Canadians' concerns about our own civil liberties and the role of state, and frankly, who would be in violation of national security, based on C-51. That was a very real question. Would people that are protesting pipelines, for example, be a threat to national security? And if so, who are those people? Who's being threatened? Who's being protected? And I think those are very much questions that have come to the surface in Canada in the past number of years. We saw it around the Syrian refugees, when the new government began to talk about bringing in Syrian refugees. Well, what was the threat? And interestingly, I was in Israel in December, and was sort of struck by many of my progressive friends saying, you know, what are you guys doing bringing in 25,000 Syrian refugees? And what if just one is, you know, makes you unsafe or is a terrorist, or, you know, and so the discourse was very different from, I think, where we were at in Canada, and yet there were still some real questions around what the screening process was. Should men be able to come in, or should families be prioritized? So I think we're very much actually in the midst of grappling with those questions.
And I'm just going to jump in and say one of the differences that I notice in the conversation is that because we do have a constitutionalized Bill of Rights in Canada, we actually have a lot of these questions being decided by our Supreme Court of Canada in an authoritative way. That is to say that they get to overturn legislation that is otherwise legitimately passed by the government. And so, of course, the conversation about the anti-terrorism legislation that Canada has so recently had kind of amped up through Bill C-51 will, if it isn't changed by the new government, end up in the Supreme Court of Canada deciding definitively what the right balance is. And so there's a way in which opponents very positively will view the presence of a Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada, but it does take the conversation out of the political realm and place it very authoritatively in the legal arena. And when you don't have a constitutionalized Bill of Rights, you don't have that same kind of legalization of politics happen so quickly and easily, perhaps.
So I guess it is right. I mean, our main tool is the basic law of human dignity and freedoms. And when we take things to Supreme Court, and sometimes Supreme Court cancel laws, it can happen. We take constitutional cases, but it's harder without Bill of Rights, obviously, without the Charter. I mean, it is harder, but this is the job. Now, something about this basic law, which is the main tool in our toolkit, that although it's about freedoms, the word that is not inside is the word equality. And the reason equality is not there, it's because no separation of religion and state. The Orthodox were against the word equality because of women's rights. So the word equality is not there. Supreme Court during the 90s, even before, but prominently during the 90s, was reading equality into dignity. Humiliation and discrimination harms your dignity. Mm-hmm. And that's how it was justified. Equality, it's a very famous case, a woman that wanted to be a pilot in the IDF. She was 18 years old. She is, as most of Israeli Jews, she was supposed to join the army. She said, I want to be a pilot, and she was rejected because she was a woman. Now, an interesting story about her, Alice Miller, is that she was a pilot already because she just made Aliyah. She moved from South Africa, and she was holding a civil license, a civil pilot license. And they told her, you can't be a pilot. And she said, what do you mean? I am driving, you know. And so we won this case, and it's a landmark case about equality. Now, last year, when we submitted this case in 1993, everybody was against us. How can you underestimate the IDF? How can you do it against the state? It was really a big issue. And last year in 2015, she was the torch bearer in the national ceremony of Independence Day. Now, what I want to say about it, that's my job as an ED, or our job as a human rights organization, is to find out what is out there and not recognized by the mainstream, marginalized, outline, and bring it to the heart of the consensus. So I think security issues is something like this, and obviously the Palestinian minority, or Israel, or the occupation, the status of refugees or asylum seekers, these are things that are being criticized by the consensus, and we have to bring it in and put it on the table and discuss it and open it for the public.
And you know, one of the things we also talked about a bit amongst ourselves before this session was the role that this kind of response based on civil liberties plays in moving societal attitudes ahead, and I think you're really pointing to that. And Mira, do you want to come in on that point?
I was just going to say it's an interesting, I think your completely accurate around the role of what is once at the margins eventually becomes mainstream. And when we look at marriage equality, dying with dignity, you look at climate scientists who were way ahead on climate change, and so many of these issues that actually don't come out of law, but come out of perhaps social movements, and how they eventually evolve into law, and sort of not to be dismissive of the, what you may call not consensus or not mainstream, or what is at one point on the fringe that tends to eventually become the point of consensus and the person who's holding the torch. So, and I think we have a lot of examples of that we're currently grappling with, whether in Canada or in Israel or beyond.
Yeah, and it's something about, the sort of ability to make sense of how these issues that seem so unusual or uncommon, and to make sense of how they actually pull on core commitments that are there already to liberty, to equality, is really a very powerful device of changing people's minds and moving what is seen to be marginal or unacceptable or unusual into what counts as normal. And I want to move to talk about women's rights, but Mira, you look like you want to come in at some point.
Something about ACRI that I really appreciate as an organization. I was looking up a little bit that here BC Civil Liberties Association would be fairly narrowly focused, within a definition of civil liberties that many of us would sort of, accept as the norm. I was interested to see that that ACRI is dealing with migrant rights and LGBTQ rights and dealing with sort of a whole range of what otherwise would be considered civil rights or human rights issues, and that I think that's an interesting coming together of sort of how you mainstream some of these issues.
Yeah, and I'll give you one example, administrative detention. Okay, administrative detention is when you detain someone with no trial. Now, we are, for the past 20 years, against administrative detention because I think there should be a due process and a fair trial, and if the state have anything against anybody, should go to court, and the judge should hear it and not detain people with no reason. Now, administrative detention was used traditionally against Palestinians. And whenever we brought it up, they said security reasons. Now, recently, it is used against right-wing settlers, Israeli Jews settlers. Now, we're consistent about it. When we're saying we are against, we are consistent about the procedure. And I think part of the reason we have success, that we are working, we are not partisan parliament party, we're a human rights organization, so we work in the Knesset, in the Parliament of Israel, with many members of the political spectrum. So on children's rights, our best ally is from Lieberman's party, which is right-wing. And on International Human Rights Day, on December 10th, we held a conference in the Knesset held by led by two members of Knesset. One is from the joint Arab-Jewish party, Dov Hanin, and the other one by Benny Begin from the Likud. So the idea is to be consistent about things, and I think that going to court is one way for social change. So I'm a lawyer by training, but I think the real work is social change. And in your toolkit, you need to have more tools. It's not enough that the Supreme Court decides something. In order to implement, people will have to listen and think. It's because this is the idea of the democracy, that the Supreme Court does not decide for everybody. So it goes together.
Yeah, and often we found in Canada that you can lose really important cases at the Supreme Court of Canada, but win on the issue because the publicity that's been created by having the court consider it has changed people's opinions and made it either possible for the government to do something or impossible for them not to do it.
Right, we were talking about that with Insight, for example, that it would be very hard for the government at this point to shut down. It's a safe injection site. It would be very hard for the government to shut it down by nature of the, popular support.
So the political sort of
political will
that's been created. But I want to go back and talk a bit about women's rights, and in both of our countries. But maybe Mira, I'll turn to you, and could you talk a bit about maybe some of the work that you're doing, or the issues in Canada that are important. And I think that inevitably this is going to lead us to talk about a more modern expansion of civil liberties to also include social and economic rights, to understand what's the sort of the full panoply of human rights for human flourishing. So Mira, women's rights in Canada.
Well, I think there's no question that, of course, equality is essential to liberty. You know, to me, the question is, of course, equality for whom, and equality of opportunity versus equality of outcome. So we can legislate these things, but that doesn't necessarily change them on the ground. And I think that's a really sort of the core point about, you know, law versus social movements. How do we change things on the ground? We're probably also dealing with an outdated version of gender, and, you know, needing to really reevaluate the way that we look at gender rights. What does that mean? Doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, the world is not fair when white women are equal to white men, right? So what does equality of gender actually look like? I think we've seen some advances in the country, in Canada recently. I think having parity in the cabinet is a strong and positive thing. Certainly a strong symbolic statement in terms of leadership and having mentors for people to see as, you know, leaders to look and feel different. But to me, that is very much the tip of the iceberg, and it's, I would say, like I said, a very important symbolic change, but perhaps just that. So what are the next steps? And, you know, I spend a lot of time working and writing, and so does the Broadbent Institute, about the need for universal childcare and the impact of that on women, but also families in our economy. And I was very struck, actually, when I was in Israel in December, by the conversation around childcare in Israel and how desperate the country is for a better childcare policy. So I think that's, and you know, many in this audience I know have been fighting for that for many, many years, but I think that's, to me, really the next step of where the country needs to go if we're serious about having a feminist prime minister, or we're serious about equal opportunity. It's clearly the one of the, you know, largest factors contributing to inequality and to gender, to both economic and gender inequality. And, you know, abortion, access to abortion in PEI is still a huge, huge issue in this country that often goes unspoken about. And then I just wanted to say some other advances, you know, that we don't perhaps think of as gender equality, and it's small and local, but I think very important, which is the work that the Vancouver School Board's done around gender-neutral bathrooms. And just something as, you know, seemingly small or perhaps insignificant to the larger good, but hugely significant to, you know, to a piece of our population and what the impacts of that are. So I think I would really encourage this conversation to move beyond women to men and to look sort of at the spectrum of gender and where transgender rights are going, and to really dig deeper into how we move the conversation from law to what's happening in practice, both in terms of, I mean, we have pay equity in law, we don't have pay equity in practice. We have, you know, support for childcare presumably in, you know, in statement, but we don't in reality, and we don't for most working women, particularly of lower income.
Sharon, how does this sort of intersect with the issues women face?
So it's about the same. So I don't think Israel is very unique in terms of women's rights or gender rights, unlike the other fields that I described. I mean, here we are like the rest of the Western world, 30% pay gap, which is not good, obviously, but ACRI as an organization is not dealing a lot with women, not because it's not important, because we try to prioritize, we are doing many things, and we have specific organizations in Israel that are dealing with women's rights. So we do sit with coalition. I agree with the analysis about the socioeconomic rights, because there is a correlation between poverty and gender. I mean, most of the single parent families will be single mothers, 96% in Israel. So this is one thing. Another, I think, something that was breakthrough this year in women's rights was something we didn't do. IRAC, the Israeli Religious Action Center, did with Women of the Wall. the fact that women can pray, or a different section will be built for women to pray after 27 years of struggle, I think it's very impressive. I'm going back to the no separation of religion and state. So it's a big issue, because divorce and dependency on the main breadwinner in the family, which is mainly men, makes an economic gap between men and women.
Well, I mean, so the last really focus that we talked about as a group, so I'm just going to move away from the discussion about women, but I think we never really move away from a discussion about gender. And so it's certainly a part of the next question as well. But I want to have each of you talk a bit about the fact that the two countries do share significant diversity. And in Canada, we talk about multiculturalism. In Israel, you have different, you have a pluralism, I suppose you could say, from religion, and it's reflected in the legal system, but there are different traditions and ethnicities that are part of the complex that is Israel. And then again, in Canada, we have the issue of reconciliation with our Indigenous peoples. And so diversity and difference, multiculturalism, are all very key tensions or struggles or things to celebrate from another perspective in each of the countries. And so Sharon, I'd like to start with you, if you could talk a bit about how this factor plays out in terms of civil liberties and the work that your organization does.
So I think in terms of human rights within Judaism, we are more tolerant. We're not doing good enough with Ethiopian Jews, for example, as we were not doing good enough, not only in the past, just in the present as well, with Mizrahi Jews. It takes time, but I think we are moving there. The elephant in the room is the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. So while we have tolerance to multiculturalism within Judaism, we are less tolerant to multiculturalism with the Palestinian Israelis and their culture. And I have to admit something that is very difficult for us to analyze, but in the past couple of years we're dealing with what we call is the shrinking democratic space in Israel due to the conflict. So there were a couple of draft bills that were bothering us in the past couple of years, and we connect the dots together and we say, okay, we can portray a shrinking democratic space towards the other, and the other is the non-Jews. So we feel it in freedom of expression, and I'm saying it because I think Israel was more a democracy that I was very proud about, and I really care about it, and this is the work, to bring a better Israel and more tolerant Israel and more democratic Israel. And if I connect the dots, we see a couple of things that need to bother us. Okay, so freedom of speech. If I look at 2013, July 2013, there was the last war in Gaza, Protective Edge. And within ACRI, we saw two things. One was happening in Gaza as the humanitarian crisis. And our work is to write to Attorney General. We work in Israel, mainly. And the other one was, we were looking at a trend, what happened in Israel. And we saw that there were voices that were against the war, and these voices, people were calling to marginalize them. So they were opening Facebook pages, private Facebook pages, calling to fire these people from their workplaces. Now in Israel, there is the Equal Employment Opportunity Act saying that you can express your views and you should be protected from being fired from workplace. Now, it was only on one side. When Arabs were criticizing or liberals were criticizing, people were saying, hey, fire them from workplace. Now, this is private pages, but if we look at the government, there were ministers that were saying, okay, don't let anybody do demonstrations against the war now. It's not a good time for demonstration. When is a good time for demonstration? I mean, this is the idea. Now, what bothers me that I'm saying, in a democratic country, you have pluralism of ideas and you have many voices. If you do have only one voice, you don't call it a democracy anymore. And this was something to bother us. Another thing that happened last month, there was an idea, a draft bill, to impeach the elected minority. So the elected majority, the Jews can impeach the elected minority, the Arabs. So there were reasons why some of the Arabs were criticized. I don't want to get into this, but there is a system, a legal system, but the Attorney General has procedure to bring to trial or to administer, to have some steps against some of the members of the parliament, remove immunity. But the idea that the majority can throw out the minority, I think it's a problem in democracy. So there is also what is known as anti-NGO bill, which is aimed against human rights organizations, especially those that are dealing with the occupied territories, that want to mark these organizations that are getting money from abroad, from foreign governments. So ACRI, for example, is not going to be harmed by this draft bill because we get 20% of our income from foreign governments, and this is only for organizations that are more than 50%. But who are these foreign governments? So the US government is paying for our anti-discrimination programs in schools, education programs, okay? EU is paying for equality for the Arab minority. So to call these governments foreign entities, that's something, I mean, the subtext you can hear. Foreign entities sounds like a traitor.
They may have copied it after our bill.
Yeah.
We had a very similar one.
So we are for transparency, and we declare 4 times a year where is our income coming from. You can see on our website. I mean, there should be a transparency, but aiming a law against specific groups, that's bothering, and that's why I'm saying portraying a shrinking democratic space.
So, I'm also thinking of the issue of citizenship and the taking away of citizenship. Right. So I think both countries have had legislation, and the Canadian legislation is very recent, but the idea that individuals with dual citizenship or who've been immigrants and have not been born Canadian, if they commit certain crimes, can have their citizenship revoked. You've had revocation of citizenship.
Yes, we do have, we still have it pending in court. So East Jerusalemite, which is, I didn't speak about it at all, but we were speaking about Israelis as citizens. We were speaking about the refugees in the Palestinian in the occupied territories. East Jerusalem is a different story. It was occupied in 1967, but unlike the refugees in West Bank and Palestine, they got a residency. So they get some certificate that looks like my ID, but it's a little different. They cannot vote for the government. It's a residency and not full citizenship. And this was some of them. There was about the minister wanted to revoke the citizenship, and we said it's not under the jurisdiction of the minister, because citizenship or residency, you're born with it, and it has to be a whole process for this. And we thought the process was not a due process. It was too easy, and it was aimed again Palestinian. I'll give you another example from 2 days ago. There was a headline that caught my eyes here when I was in Toronto a couple of days ago, that refugees from Gaza would be able to leave Gaza if they're living for more than a year. So I learned a couple of things from this headline. One, you learn that people from Gaza cannot leave Gaza, usually, okay? I have a passport in my bag and I travel whenever I want. I enjoy freedom of transportation that I don't think twice about it, to be honest, okay? I renew it and I guess you too, some people are noting, yes. So people in Gaza cannot travel. Now we're speaking about security reasons and revoking residency, status, whatever. So if there's a security reasons, don't let them travel. Why do you let them travel if they travel for more than a year? Because these are not security reasons. It means that they have a place to go to. And that's why we're willing to give them. So it's all together combined with the elephant in the room.
Yes, yeah.
And not an isolated issue. I mean, as you were saying, we were dealing with this with Bill C-24 here, and I saw recently that the French minister, the minister in France, just resigned over this exact issue, over revoking citizenship as well, the Attorney General there. So certainly it's a global issue that we're dealing with in terms of who's legal and, you know, who has the freedom to travel and how countries are setting laws over, you know, over that exact issue.
Do you want to talk a bit about the sort of multiculturalism and the tensions in Canada that pertain to the differences that we have across and between groups?
Yeah, I mean, I think that to some degree we would probably all agree that Canada views itself and sort of prides itself off being a multicultural country. And yet, to some degree, I think that term, I would suggest, is a bit outdated, that we need to move to more of a term of talking about pluralism, because multiculturalism, of course, in the 70s was born out of a desire to, was about immigrants and about new Canadians. And it never dealt with, you know, the First Peoples of this country, and it never addressed the historical inequalities that we're dealing with now through reconciliation. So, and I think that's, as a Jew anyways, I think a challenge in some ways. For many of us, Canada was a refuge, and our families came here for safety and security, and yet at that exact time, of course, you know, kids were being taken from their homes and sent to residential schools. And so how do you reconcile, you know, a multicultural, sort of pride yourself on multiculturalism when for many people that time was, you know, this is a very dark history. And I think we're still really addressing those challenges. I mean, I would argue that not having clean water on reserves is, you know, a failing of multiculturalism. I would argue that, you know, Cindy Blackstock's case around underfunding of First Nations education is, you know, is a failing of multiculturalism. And of course, I don't think that by nature of us just being together, you know, creates equality. It's certainly better than not, but, and I think it creates the space for a more just society, but that there's clearly still enormous work to do in that realm. So.
Which, in a sense, to use your metaphors, to say that there are elephants in each of the country's rooms, really, really tough issues that people dance around often, but don't always talk about as directly as needs to be talked about.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
No, just that we're dealing in other ways as well with, you know, I mean, the niqab issue during the election was obviously a huge piece of sort of how we address different kinds of Canadians living in this country. And the Taylor Bouchard Commission focused a lot on this. Where is it appropriate to infringe on rights and where is it not? And I think that's a very live and open question right now in Canada, and sort of highlights where we are at with a pluralistic society.
So I see the rabbi approaching, and that's good, because I was looking for you to see if it was time to open the conversation up a bit broader and to take some questions from the audience.
Yes, I think it is, and I was told that Rabbi's prerogative, I get to ask the first question. So, thank you. Let's a round of applause first for our incredible. It really was a fascinating conversation, and I'm so glad that we are having it. I'm so pleased to know of the work that ACRI is doing, and so impressed with the plurality of the stance that the organization takes so often. And I thank you both for illuminating parallels with Canada and larger issues. I guess among the many questions that I could ask, one that I guess sort of with my rabbinic yarmulke on, I'm curious to know how, because ACRI is not a religious organization, but to what extent does Jewish law, Jewish custom, Jewish ethics play in the types of cases or the motivations that ACRI and its lawyers have in doing the work that they do? Where does the idea of tikkun olam, the idea of gemilut chasadim, the idea of tzedek tirdof, where, if anywhere, does that have a foundation?
So I think it's not under, it's not written on the board on the entrance to the office. But I guess for me, it's definitely tikkun olam, as I started where I come from and what is my feeling towards minorities. Some of our lawyers are Arab Israelis, some of our lawyers are Jews. We work together. I think, for me, you know, some of the struggles are really hard. Sometimes you get up in the morning and you're asking yourself, really? Do I want to deal with it? On the other hand, getting to the office and working with these wonderful people. My colleagues are inspiration, you know, we're sitting together. During the war, it was really hard. My nephew was in the IDF. Some of my Arab colleagues have families in Gaza. I have friends in Ramallah, so I went to school in the US. Some of my friends are Palestinians. We were going to school together. First person to call or text me after a missile in Tel Aviv was my friend from Ramallah saying everything is okay. So it's really crazy sometimes, but I think it's the deep feeling of what is right. I mean, you can call it Jewish, you can call it other. These are the values I grew up on. I believe we can make the world better. I think it's important not to give up on this. We're being criticized, saying, how can you criticize Israel in a time like this? I criticize Israel because I care about Israel. I want to have a better Israel. I think we all deserve a better Israel. And, you know, I'm being a parent as well. And when your child is doing things that are not good, it's our duty to tell them, this is not good, you can do better. And not just give up on them and say, okay, they're my children, they're great. You know, it's... So there are many things together. I think as individuals we bring values. Definitely my personal history and the fact that my grandparents were survivors, it's there. And I think in general from the Holocaust there is lesson that we all agree about, never again. But the two paths that are taking from this, there's one path saying never again to us, and the other path is saying never again to anybody. And I think this is the big conflict that I see out there today. And for me, the path is clear. It's never again to anybody. It's not just about myself. It's בצלם אלוהים ברא אותם.
We do have time for a few questions. If you just raise your hand. If you'll stand up, and you're not mic'd, but maybe the speakers can repeat the question as well. Thank you.
Hi. Sharon, you mentioned that there's recently you ceased with the racial profiling against the Arabs, which is great, but I'm wondering if the statistics changed on security after that.
The statistic is not...
So,
Okay.
do you want me to? So, it was great to hear that the racial profiling has reduced, but what are the statistics about terrorism? Is that security? About what are the statistics around security issues after this reduction in racial profiling?
So the surprising thing with this case that we learned from the papers that the Israelis, the General Security Services, the Shabak, was not against our petition because Israeli Arabs, Palestinian Israeli, are nearly not involved in terrorism in Israel. And that's why we were claiming the racial profiling was random. Now, the Ministry of Justice was against it, but the Security Service were saying we were right. Now, this was an article that we learned from the papers. Later on, we learned what was behind. So that's what I'm saying, that security reasons cannot cover everything, because the numbers, as in other cases of family reunification that were stopped for Palestinian spouses, like process of like green card in the US, if you're marrying someone else, naturalization. So in 2003, there was a decision to stop any naturalization process for Palestinian spouses from the occupied territories. Now, usually, those spouses were of Israeli Arabs, not Israeli Jews. It's very rare. So we took it to Supreme Court. This is a case I argued, actually, that we said this is discrimination against Israeli Arabs, and there's no justification if you look at the numbers. So statistic is really important. It's hard to get the numbers because not all the numbers are out there. We are dependent on the government. But it's a good question, and the answer is that the participation of Israeli Arabs, Palestinian Israelis in terror attacks is meager.
Which is also, I think, a common lesson learned, that when security measures are challenged and reduced, they're often shown not to be warranted by the facts, and that you get caught up in larger political moments that allow certain kinds of measures that really that don't do what even those who are proponents of them claim they will do. So that's a good example of that.
I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit on to what extent or whether or not Palestinians in the territories are aware of this struggle, this debate, this conversation that Israelis like you are having with the government.
So 15 years ago, we had more contact with Palestinian organization. Today, we are suffering from the BDS as well, not working with human rights organization on the Palestinian side. I think it's not, there's no similarity because we have institutional government and we are a state. It's easier to address. I know where to go. I know that my address is Supreme Court and I'm going there. For them, because the Palestinian Authority is not, I don't know how to say it, well organized, or the whole structure is different, it's hard for them to address. We are in some touch. We are representing some Palestinian people. 2 months ago, we submitted a petition to our Supreme Court about the right to water. A whole village is without running water. And we said that in 2016, in the startup nation, under the regime of the startup nation, it couldn't be that human beings will be with no running water. So we represent them sometimes. There are also organizations there, but we have to understand that there's no symmetric. It's not symmetric, the situation in Israel and in Palestine.
Back to when you're talking about the Syrian refugees coming in and not as great number offering them like a aid from Syria away from the war, do you think it's the best decision of Canada to make, even though our local citizens can barely afford to live in Canada?
It's a really good question.
So, sure. So the question recognized how important it is that Canada is offering Syrian refugees a haven from the war that they face in their original homeland. But is the decision a wise one, given the fact that many Canadians here can't themselves afford the basics of the basic necessities?
I think you raise a really good question. I don't think it's an either or, personally. I think that Canada has a right to, or an obligation to take in refugees, and I'm proud of, as a country, that we've done that. I think there are questions about why Syrian refugees as opposed to others who are living in conflict, and are we prioritizing, one group of refugees over another, and if so, why? And I think that's a really legitimate question to be argued. But I think the policies that would lead to greater opportunity for all should absolutely, are what I fight for every day, and what I think Canadians should aspire to in terms of how we live as a country. So should there be, First Nations on reserves without clean water? No. Should there be, a living wage for people living in, Metro Vancouver? Should there be rent that people can afford to actually live here? Absolutely. And I think, interestingly, the bringing refugees to Canada has highlighted some of those issues. It's, one thing to, you'll know this well, it's one thing to bring over families and sponsor them for a year. I have a good friends in New West who sponsored a family of 6, and after 4 months of 12 of them living together, they tried to find them an apartment, and even in New West, there was absolutely no way this family could find a 2-bedroom apartment for 6 of them that they could afford. So there's systemic issues. These are structural issues that I think we face both as Canadians and for anyone who is coming here, both that need to be addressed no matter what. But I don't think it should exclude our commitment to being open to others.
And I would just add that the rabbinic dictum, because we're involved in the refugee sponsorship issue, that it's not upon us to complete the task, but neither are we free to desist from it. And just because we can't do it all doesn't mean we can do nothing. Please.
So I think Mira very lovely sort of explained
So it's
shall I phrase the question? So the question began by saying that Mira did a lovely job of talking about the way in which social movements often lead to legal change, and in particular, the point was made about the youth in Canada through areas like environmental law and women's rights and issues around LGBT questions have resulted in the kind of change that has changed the law. And so the question to Sharon was whether the youth have played similar roles in Israel. I guess social movements with youth leaders resulting in the kinds of changes that see ultimately legal reform as well. Is that fair?
So as I said, first I speak about ACRI. So we have a legal department, but we have also an education department that doesn't work directly with youth, but with teachers. We work with teachers, what to bring to classrooms. As for social change, in summer of 2011, we had the social uprising, I don't know how to call it, and there was big demonstration on the street, as like in North America as well. It did not translate into political power in the end of the day. If we look at the elections, and otherwise, I don't think it's translated to power. And there are youth movements. I'm not sure the answer is yes at this stage.
Yes, please.
Yeah, Sharon, to what extent does the concept or the notion of loyalty inhibit the development of civil rights, civil liberties? In other words, the notion of loyalty in Israel as a bar to full development of rights and liberties. And also, just a side technical question, if you don't have a codified set of rights and liberties, what's the basis? Common law in Israel?
So sorry, I'll do it again. Two questions. The first is the role that loyalty plays in the development of civil rights and civil liberties, or the challenge perhaps that loyalty presents. And the second is a more technical question about the absence of, it was called codified rights and freedoms. How then does one bring the sorts of challenges that you do? Did I get it?
So loyalty is being used today by right wing to marginalize the Arab population, the Israeli Arab citizens. In a way, it's being used that there is demand for loyalty. On the other hand, the claim of the Arab population is that they're not getting equality. So I said that the shrinking democratic space, so a couple of years ago, a law passed, it's called the Nakba law. Nakba is another word for catastrophe that is being used by Israeli Arabs for the 1948 war. Now, that's hard. For me, it's Independence Day. For them, it's catastrophe. How do you reconcile? How do you deal with it? To be honest, as an Israeli Jew, it's hard for me. But I think it's, in order to get over it, is to speak about it and to deal with it. And I look at other examples around the world, and I think, look at South Africa. They were going through very hard issues. So the law of the Nakba says that it's illegal to commemorate or remember, or in the public sphere to use the term Nakba or to think about it. So this is something that in the public sphere we do not acknowledge others, people, disaster, catastrophe. It's hard for me to say, but you know. Now, the leader of the Joint Arab-Jewish Party, Ayman Udeh, on last Yom HaShoah said the Memorial Day for the Shoah, the Holocaust, said that he thinks that there is a siren in Israel at the time of Holocaust, that everybody stands for one moment. And he said that it's important for the Arab to stand in such a moment. Because he said, if we want our catastrophe to be acknowledged, we have to acknowledge the greater catastrophe in the 20th century. And I'm going back to promoting a discourse and not only legal. So there's a law banning commemorating or speaking about the Nakba or using it. And in terms of 20% of the population, part of their history is not acknowledged. Now, it's hard to ask for loyalty when we have not acknowledging problems. So it's really, really, really delicate. From one hand, we exempt them from army service because we don't want them, we the majority, to be partners in the army because of loyalty. On the other hand, we say, okay, why aren't you doing your duties as equal citizens? So it's really complicated. What is important for me, the reason I'm speaking here tonight also, is to explain that there's no black and white, good or bad. It's very complicated, and in this way it should be solved in a very delicate way.
Do you want to just quickly answer the question about how rights are protected? Or
Yes, the basic laws are treated like the charter, and there's also the common law that we inherit from the Brits. We inherit other things from the Ottoman Empire, as you remember from the beginning, but most of the things are by common law, and the basic law are constitutional. We can go directly to Supreme Court, no need to appeal. So, and it's not even expensive, the fees, but you have to meet some threshold, and this is something that our lawyers are doing.
Be careful.
My name is Joan Garson, and I'm the president of the New Israel Fund of Canada. And on all of our behalfs, I would like once again to say thank you and to let you know how honored I have been to listen to the two of you so ably chaired by you, Margot. Thank you so much on all of our behalfs.
Thanks. That was great.
This evening leaves me with many questions, and one of them I'll share with the room. What is my obligation when I hear this conversation as a person who treasures democracy, who treasures my relationship with Israel? Is it enough to listen and to learn? Before I answer that question, let me tell you where I come from in considering it. 3 points. First of all, as I suspect all of you are, I am aware of my personal obligation to help make a better world, to work for Tikkun Olam. What active obligation does that impose on me here? Secondly, I love Israel, and I experience that love as a spur to action. I am simply unable to sit and say, I'll leave it to someone else. I feel a sense of personal obligation, and I know that many in Israel rely on those of us who live abroad for values and for support. As long as I live here and not there, what should I do? And thirdly, on a personal note, I have a daughter who is getting married in Israel in a few months, getting married by a Reform rabbi in Israel, which of course doesn't count, and then coming to Canada to get married by a judge. She has chosen to make her life there, and I hope to have grandchildren. That makes it even more personal for me. What kind of a world do I want my daughter, her lovely Israeli husband-to-be, and my putative grandchildren to live in? Can I leave this obligation to someone else? I imagine that each of us here tonight has a personal link or an experience, a reason that made us come, and a reason to feel personally obligated. When I introduced Sharon at a recent event, I said, how do you know when you meet a hero? Is there a flag or a secret handshake? The answer I learned is that there's no simple way to tell that you are dealing with a hero other than by her actions. And this is very Jewish. We are judged by what we do and not by what we say. I think that Sharon and ACRI are modern heroes. In the words of a young man who heard her in Toronto last night, she exemplifies Israel's beating democratic heart and gives hope for Israel's future. Just as I look to what Sharon does and not only to what she says, I have to look to and judge my own actions. What am I going to do? We live in a very challenging time for democratic shared values in Israel. Israelis are looking to us not only to speak, but to act our support by learning, by visiting, and financially, so that we can ensure the continued existence of critical organizations such as ACRI. So now I think you have guessed what I believe we must do. I hope you will all join me in generously supporting the New Israel Fund of Canada, and through it, ACRI and the many other organizations that work to make a better and more democratic Israel. I want to hold my head high and say I support a better Israel. I personally take on that obligation, and I hope that you will too. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to Temple Sholom and Rabbi Dan for your wonderful hospitality, and I hope to see you all again here and next year in Jerusalem. Thank you.
Thank you, Joan. Thank you to our panel. It wouldn't be a Jewish function without food, so if you'll join us in our social hall for some coffee and some cookies, and I'm sure our panel will join us there as well. Erev Tov.
Good job, Mira. That was great. You're welcome.
That was great. I learned a lot.
I wish.
Hi, Margot.
Hi, how are you doing?
Good, how's it going?
Fine, fine.
I'm thrilled that you're here.
Thank you so much. That's very nice. I'm thrilled to be here.
From the Jewish Independent loves the photos, so.
Okay.
Thank you. You were terrific.